Life has a way of teaching us the most profound lessons when we least expect them. For Michael Thompson, that lesson would come in the form of a decorated war hero he chose to ignore, a moment of indifference that would haunt him and ultimately transform his understanding of courage, compassion, and what it truly means to serve others. The bustling streets of downtown Seattle pulsated with the familiar rhythm of a Monday morning rush hour. Towering skyscrapers cast long shadows across the rain-slicked pavement, their glass facades reflecting the rare patches of sunlight that managed to break through the characteristic Pacific Northwest cloud cover. The air was thick with the rich aroma of coffee from countless cafes, mingling with the sharp scent of wet concrete and the distant salt breeze from Elliott Bay. Michael Thompson navigated the crowded sidewalks with the practiced precision of a seasoned urban professional. At 35, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored navy suit and Italian leather briefcase, his carefully styled dark hair barely disturbed by the light drizzle. His steel-rimmed glasses occasionally caught the glint of morning light, giving him an air of intellectual authority that he had cultivated over years in corporate finance. The constant buzz of his smartphone commanded his attention as he weaved between slower pedestrians, his thumb scrolling through an endless stream of emails and meeting notifications. His brow furrowed slightly as he mentally rehearsed the figures for his upcoming presentation to the board. After 8 years at Pacific Northwest Financial, the position of Senior Investment Director was finally within reach. This morning's presentation could be the final push he needed to secure the promotion he'd been meticulously working toward. The streets grew more congested as Michael approached the heart of the financial district. The symphony of city sounds intensified, the impatient honking of taxi horns, the hiss of bus brakes, the clatter of construction work from a nearby building site, and the constant murmur of hundreds of conversations blending into a familiar urban chorus. Groups of professionals clutching coffee cups huddled under the protective awnings of office buildings, while bicycle couriers darted through the traffic with reckless abandon. Michael's attention remained fixed on his phone screen, his mind running through the projection models he'd spent the weekend perfecting. The quarterly forecasts were aggressive, but he was confident in his analysis. The Asian markets had shown promising trends, and his risk assessment framework was solid. He'd rehearsed his presentation until every pause, every gesture, every response to potential questions was carefully calibrated for maximum impact. As he waited at a crowded intersection, Michael's fingers danced across his phone's keyboard, firing off rapid responses to urgent emails. A young intern had sent him the updated market reports he'd requested, and the numbers aligned perfectly with his projections. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Everything was falling into place. The promotion would mean not just a substantial salary increase, but also a corner office with a view of the bay, a seat on the executive committee, and most importantly, validation of the countless sacrifices he'd made to reach this point. The crosswalk signal changed, and the crowd surged forward like a wave. Michael moved with them, his feet carrying him forward on autopilot, while his mind remained absorbed in the digital world of financial data and corporate communications. The mass of pedestrians included the usual mix of Seattle's downtown workforce: tech employees in casual hoodies and jeans, construction workers in fluorescent vests, baristas in green aprons and suits like himself, all focused on their own morning missions. Through the gap in the crowd, Michael caught a glimpse of something that briefly penetrated his bubble of concentration. A woman in a wheelchair, struggling to navigate the curb, cut at the corner of the intersection. She appeared to be in her late 40s, wearing a crisp, military-style jacket despite the mild weather. Her wheelchair's wheel had caught on an uneven portion of the ramp where it met the street, causing her to rock back and forth as she attempted to find the right angle to overcome the obstacle. For a fraction of a second, Michael's step faltered. A flicker of recognition passed through his mind. Someone needed help. But as quickly as the thought arose, it was subsumed by the urgent vibration of his phone and the looming pressure of his impending presentation. The rational part of his brain quickly calculated the variables. Stopping would mean potentially missing the light, adding precious minutes to his commute, arriving at the office with less time to prepare. Surely someone else would help. There were dozens of people around, and he had a career-defining moment waiting for him. The moment of hesitation passed, and Michael stepped off the curb, his long strides carrying him swiftly across the intersection. His conscious mind had already begun to push the image of the struggling woman aside, filing it away in the category of "not my problem." The familiar weight of his briefcase, the reassuring ping of incoming emails, and the mental rehearsal of his presentation points created a comfortable barrier between himself and the scene he was leaving behind. Little did Michael know that this small moment of indifference, this split-second decision to prioritize his own concerns over the needs of another, would soon return to challenge everything he thought he knew about success, service, and the true meaning of valor. As he disappeared into the gleaming tower that housed Pacific Northwest Financial, the seeds of a profound transformation had already been planted, waiting for the right moment to shatter his carefully constructed worldview. The 40th floor of Pacific Northwest Financial buzzed with the controlled energy of high-stakes commerce. Michael stepped out of the elevator into a world of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning light casting long shadows across the minimalist decor. The click of his Oxford shoes against the stone floor echoed through the corridor as he made his way to his office, nodding briefly to colleagues already huddled around their Bloomberg terminals. His corner office in waiting, currently occupied by retiring Senior Investment Director Robert Chen, taunted him from the end of the hall. Through its glass walls, Michael could see the sprawling view of Elliott Bay he'd soon claim as his own. Just a few more hours, one more presentation, and that vista would be his daily inspiration. The thought straightened his spine and quickened his stride. Inside his current office, Michael settled into his ergonomic chair with practiced efficiency. His monitors sprang to life, displaying an array of market data, news feeds, and the presentation he'd refined to perfection over the weekend. The familiar rhythm of pre-market trading numbers scrolling across his screens created a comforting backdrop to his final preparations. "Morning, Michael," Emmy Chen called from his doorway. As Robert's daughter and a junior analyst, she carried herself with the confident air of someone who'd grown up in the world of finance. "Dad's looking forward to your presentation. The board's particularly interested in your Asia-Pacific expansion strategy." Michael's fingers paused over his keyboard. "Thanks, Emmy. How's he feeling about his last week?" "You know, Dad, already planning his retirement adventures. He's convinced he'll master kite surfing by Christmas." She smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "Just don't forget to mention the Sullivan account. He's worried about maintaining continuity with our legacy clients during the transition." Michael nodded, making a mental note. Robert had built the Sullivan relationship over 2 decades, turning a modest pension fund into one of their largest institutional clients. "I've got it covered. Section 3 of my presentation focuses entirely on client retention strategies." As Emmy disappeared down the hallway, Michael returned to his preparations. He'd learned early in his career that success in finance wasn't just about numbers. It was about understanding the human elements, the relationships, the unspoken expectations. His presentation needed to convince the board not only of his technical expertise, but of his ability to maintain the delicate web of trust Robert had woven over his 30-year career. The morning progressed with mechanical precision. Michael rehearsed key points while responding to urgent emails, pausing occasionally to check the Asian market's closing figures. His secretary delivered his usual morning coffee, double espresso, no sugar, and a portfolio of client reports he'd requested for reference during the presentation. At his desk, Michael methodically reviewed his talking points. The promotion to senior investment director would put him in charge of over $12 billion in assets. The responsibility was immense, but he'd been preparing for this moment since his days at Wharton. Every late night, every missed weekend, every sacrificed relationship had been leading to this. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Good luck today, sweetheart. Dad would have been so proud." Michael swallowed hard, his hand instinctively, moving to straighten his father's old tie clip, the only piece of sentimentality he allowed in his professional wardrobe. James Thompson had been a beat cop, worlds away from the financial heights his son now occupied, but he'd taught Michael the value of discipline, of never backing down from a challenge. The memory of his father triggered something else, a fleeting image of the woman in the wheelchair from earlier that morning. Michael pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the dashboard displays of market performance and risk metrics. He had more important things to concern himself with right now. A knock at his door announced the arrival of Tom Martinez, his closest colleague and longtime mentor. "Ready for the big show?" Tom asked, his characteristic grin failing to completely mask the tension in his voice. As Chief Risk Officer, Tom had championed Michael's promotion behind the scenes, staking some of his own professional capital on his protégé's success. "Born ready," Michael replied with practiced confidence, gathering his materials. "The numbers are solid, the strategies sound, and I've got contingencies mapped for every possible question." Tom nodded approvingly, but held up a cautioning finger. "Just remember, the board isn't looking for just another numbers guy. Robert's shoes are big ones to fill, and not just because of his technical expertise. His people skills, his integrity, his ability to see beyond the spreadsheets. That's what made him invaluable." Michael resisted the urge to check his phone one last time as they walked toward the conference room. The hallways had grown quieter, most of the staff already settled into their daily routines. Through the windows, the morning fog had begun to lift, revealing a city fully awakened to its daily pursuits. The conference room door loomed ahead, its frosted glass concealing the group of executives who would decide his fate. Michael took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders and adjusting his tie. This was his moment, the culmination of years of sacrifice and determination. Nothing else mattered, not the mornings encountered, not the nagging voice of conscience, not the fleeting doubts about the cost of his ambitions. Inside the conference room, the board members were already assembled, their expressions carefully neutral as they reviewed the materials before them. Robert Chen sat at the head of the table, his presence a reminder of the legacy Michael hoped to inherit. As Michael moved to the front of the room, setting up his presentation with practiced movements, he felt the weight of their collective scrutiny. Michael's presentation flowed like a well-orchestrated symphony. His voice carried confidently across the conference room as he walked the board through projection charts and risk analyses. The Asian market figures drew approving nods, and his detailed plan for maintaining key client relationships seemed to particularly impress Robert Chen, who leaned forward with interest during that segment. "As you can see from these projections," Michael gestured towards the screen, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Our proposed expansion into emerging Southeast Asian markets could increase our portfolio yield by 12% within the first 18 months. The numbers danced across the screen, each graph and chart a testament to weeks of meticulous preparation. Yet, as he moved through his carefully crafted slides, something felt off. The usual rush of excitement that came with a perfect presentation was muted, overshadowed by an inexplicable sense of unease. Every few minutes his mind would flash back to the morning's encounter, the woman in the wheelchair, struggling alone at the intersection. The image would appear unbidden between slides, between sentences, like a persistent echo he couldn't quite silence. Robert Chen's voice cut through his thoughts. "Michael, these numbers are impressive, but tell me about continuity. How do you plan to maintain the personal touch our clients have come to expect?" The question was direct, laden with the weight of 3 decades of relationship building. Michael launched into his prepared response about client retention strategies and relationship management, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. His gaze drifted to the window, where the Seattle skyline stretched out below. Somewhere down there, a woman had needed help, and he had walked away. The realization cast a strange shadow over his polished corporate rhetoric about personal touch and client care. "One final question," came the voice of Margaret Walsh, the board's most senior member. "What would you say sets you apart as a candidate for this position? What unique perspective do you bring to the role?" The question hung in the air as Michael prepared to deliver his carefully rehearsed response about his technical expertise and strategic vision. But something made him hesitate. In that moment of pause, the morning scene replayed in his mind with crystal clarity, the woman's determined expression, the subtle plea in her eyes, his own calculated decision to keep walking. His response, when it came, felt mechanical, disconnected from the growing turmoil in his thoughts. He spoke about his track record, his education, his dedication to the firm, but each word seemed to echo with the hollow ring of partial truth. The board members nodded along, making notes, their faces revealing nothing. As the presentation concluded and the questions tapered off, Michael felt the strange disconnection intensify. On the surface, everything had gone according to plan. His delivery had been flawless, his responses measured and precise. Yet something had shifted inside him, a subtle but persistent disturbance in his carefully ordered world. "Thank you, Michael," Robert said, rising from his chair. "We'll need time to deliberate, of course, but you've given us much to consider." The other board members murmured in agreement, gathering their materials. The meeting was over, but the unease lingered. Back in his office, Michael loosened his tie and sank into his chair. The morning sun had risen fully now, filling the room, with warm light that seemed at odds with his troubled thoughts. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues who had watched his presentation, but he left them unanswered. Instead, he found himself staring at his reflection in the window, seeing himself as if for the first time. The perfectly pressed suit, the carefully styled hair, the professional demeanor he had cultivated so carefully, all of it suddenly seemed like an elaborate costume, a shield behind which he had hidden from simpler, more fundamental truths. The woman in the wheelchair kept appearing in his mind's eye, her struggle becoming a metaphor for something larger, something he couldn't quite grasp. He had walked past her without a second thought, focused entirely on his own goals, his own success. What did that say about the person he had become? His computer screen still displayed the final slide of his presentation, the one highlighting his vision for the firm's future. The bullet points about leadership, integrity, and client service now seemed to mock him. How could he claim to be a leader when he couldn't spare 30 seconds to help someone in need? What kind of integrity allowed him to simply walk past? Human suffering in pursuit of personal gain. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and calls, but Michael's usual sharp focus was compromised. In the budget review, he found himself doodling abstract patterns in his notebook, his mind wandering back to the intersection. During a client call, he had to ask for questions to be repeated, his thoughts scattered and unfocused. By lunchtime, the pretense of normalcy had become exhausting. Instead of joining his usual group in the executive dining room, Michael found himself drawn to the solitude of his office. He stood at the window, looking down at the street below, watching the endless stream of people flowing through the city. Like a human river, From this height, they all looked the same, tiny figures moving with purpose through the urban landscape. How many of them, he wondered, were like him, so focused on their destination that they had forgotten how to see the journey? How many opportunities for simple human connection were missed in the relentless pursuit of success? The weight of these questions pressed against his consciousness, demanding attention he couldn't spare, yet couldn't deny. The morning's presentation, which should have been a triumphant milestone in his career, had instead become a catalyst for an uncomfortable self-examination he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he welcomed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Michael's office windows as he attempted to focus on his work. His computer screen displayed a complex spreadsheet of market analyses, but the numbers seemed to blur together, refusing to hold his attention. The morning's presentation, which should have left him energized and triumphant, instead left a peculiar, hollow feeling in his chest. His phone buzzed with another congratulatory message, this time from Emmy Chen. Board seemed impressed. Dad was particularly pleased with your client retention strategy. Michael stared at the message, unable to summon his usual satisfaction at such praise. Instead, his mind kept wandering back to the intersection, to the woman in the wheelchair, to the moment he had chosen to walk away. I didn't have time, he muttered to himself, straightening papers on his desk with unnecessary force. The presentation was crucial. Someone else must have helped her. But even as he formed the words, they rang hollow in the quiet of his office. He had always prided himself on his ability to rationalize difficult decisions, to focus on the bigger picture, but today that skill seemed to be failing him. A knock on his door provided a welcome interruption. Tom Martinez entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the artisanal cafe downstairs. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing 1 cup on Michael's desk. "You've been holed up in here since the presentation." Michael accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Just catching up on some reports," he lied, gesturing vaguely at his computer screen. Tom settled into one of the visitor chairs, studying his protégé with knowing eyes. "You know," Tom began, his voice casual, but his expression shrewd, "I've watched a lot of presentations in my time. Yours was technically perfect, every number in place, every projection backed by solid analysis. But something was off. You weren't quite yourself up there." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What do you mean? The board seemed satisfied?" "Satisfied, yes. But Robert Chen didn't build his legacy on satisfaction. He built it on connection, on understanding that behind every number is a human story." Tom paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "Today it felt like you were reading from a script rather than sharing a vision." The words hit uncomfortably close to the turmoil in Michael's mind. He stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Below, the city continued its endless dance of motion, cars weaving through traffic, pedestrians hurrying along sidewalks, life flowing in its predictable patterns. "I saw something this morning," Michael found himself saying, the words escaping before he could stop them. "A woman in a wheelchair struggling at an intersection. I just walked past her." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than he'd expected. Tom remained silent, waiting for him to continue. The absence of immediate judgment somehow made it worse. "I kept telling myself I didn't have time, that the presentation was too important, that someone else would help." Michael's voice grew quieter. "But the truth is, I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to risk being late, didn't want anything to disrupt my perfect morning routine." "And now?" Tom prompted gently. "Now, I can't stop thinking about it. About her, about what kind of person just walks past someone who needs help." Michael ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting its ordered appearance. "What does that say about me, Tom? About who I've become?" Tom set his coffee cup down carefully. "You know, before I went into finance, I served in the army. 2 tours in Afghanistan. This was news to Michael, who turned to look at his mentor with surprise. One thing I learned there: the true measure of a person isn't in their successes or their failures, but in how they respond when someone needs help. The word struck Michael with unexpected force. He thought about his father, the cop who had never been too busy to help a stranger, who had taught him about duty and service. When had he strayed so far from those lessons? The thing about choices, Michael, Tom continued, is that we get to make new ones every day. The question isn't whether you made the wrong choice this morning. It's what you're going to do with that realization. Michael sank back into his chair, the pristine skyline view suddenly seeming less important than it had just hours ago. The promotion, the corner office, the prestige he'd been chasing, all of it felt somehow hollow in the face of this simple truth. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email from Robert Chen requesting a follow-up meeting tomorrow morning. Under normal circumstances, this would have sent him into a frenzy of preparation, but now he found himself strangely detached from the usual urgency. "You know what the hardest thing about leadership is?" Tom asked, standing to leave. "It's not making the big decisions, the strategic choices that look good in presentations. It's maintaining your humanity while you do it. Robert knows that. I think deep down you do too." Left alone in his office, Michael found himself opening his browser, typing "Wheelchair Accessibility Seattle" into the search bar. The results painted a picture he'd never considered before. The daily challenges faced by people with mobility issues, the importance of simple acts of assistance, the way society often rendered them invisible. The sun was setting now, painting the Seattle skyline in shades of orange and pink. Michael gathered his things, his movements lacking their usual purposeful efficiency. The day had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand, and as he stepped into the elevator, he knew that tomorrow would require choices about who he was, about who he wanted to be, about what truly mattered in the measure of a life. The evening wrapped Seattle in its characteristic misty embrace as Michael stepped out of Pacific Northwest Financial's towering headquarters. The rush-hour crowd had thinned, leaving behind a quieter, more contemplative city. Street lamps flickered to life, their warm glow reflecting off the wet pavement and creating halos in the light drizzle. Instead of heading straight to his usual parking garage, Michael found his feet carrying him toward the intersection where he'd encountered the woman in the wheelchair that morning. The memory felt simultaneously distant and painfully immediate, like a splinter working its way deeper under his skin. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of his earlier choice. The crosswalk looked different in the evening light. The uneven curb cut that had caused the woman such difficulty was clearly visible now that he actually looked for it. How many times had he crossed here, never noticing the subtle ridge where concrete met asphalt? How many other details of daily life had he missed in his relentless pursuit of professional success? A young woman with a service dog waited patiently at the corner for the light to change. Without thinking, Michael found himself watching how she navigated the crossing, noting the careful way her companion guided her around potential obstacles. The interaction between human and animal spoke of trust, of mutual dependence, of a kind of connection he realized had been missing from his own life for far too long. His phone buzzed, a message from his mother. How did the presentation go? Michael stared at the text, remembering her earlier message about his father. James Thompson had never made it to retirement, his life cut short by a heart attack while helping a stranded motorist on a rainy night much like this one. The irony of his own behavior this morning in light of his father's final act of service wasn't lost on him. Rather than heading home, Michael found himself wandering the downtown streets. The evening crowd was different from the morning rush, more leisurely, less focused on destinations than journeys. He passed restaurants filling with dinner guests, shops closing for the night, street musicians packing up their instruments. Each scene seemed to hold details he'd never noticed before, stories he'd never taken the time to read. Outside a small cafe, an elderly man struggled with a heavy door while balancing a cane and a takeout bag. Without hesitation, Michael stepped forward to help, holding the door and steadying the man's elbow. The simple "thank you, son" he received in return sparked something warm and forgotten in his chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with market projections or career advancement. The interaction left him more unsettled than before. How many similar opportunities had he missed over the years? How many small chances to connect, to help, to be more than just another suit rushing through the city's canyons of glass and steel? His wandering brought him to Pike Place Market, normally bustling with tourists, but now quietly winding down for the evening. A few vendors were still closing up their stalls, their movements unhurried and practiced. The scent of flowers, fish, and coffee mingled in the air, creating a distinctly Seattle perfume that he'd somehow stopped noticing over the years. Finding an empty bench overlooking Elliott Bay, Michael sat down, loosening his tie. The ferryboats moved across the water like floating cities, their lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. From his pocket, he pulled out his father's old tie clip, simple bronze, nothing like the expensive accessories he now favored. He turned it over in his hands, remembering how his father would wear it proudly to every important occasion. "The uniform doesn't make the man, Mickey," his father used to say, using the childhood nickname Michael had long since outgrown. "It's what you do when you're wearing it that counts." The memory brought a lump to his throat. When had he stopped living by those words? When had the symbol become more important than the substance? A street performer nearby began playing a melancholic tune on an old guitar, the music carrying softly over the evening air. The song seemed to give voice to the confusion in Michael's heart, its gentle melody weaving through his thoughts, like a thread trying to stitch together disparate parts of himself. He pulled out his phone again, this time opening his calendar. Tomorrow was packed with meetings, calls, follow-ups from today's presentation. The schedule that normally gave him a sense of purpose now felt like a prison of his own making. Each 15-minute block represented another opportunity to rush past someone in need, another chance to choose ambition over humanity. The laptop in his briefcase held the presentation he'd delivered that morning. Opening it now, the slides seemed hollow, the carefully crafted phrases about leadership and vision ringing false. What kind of leader walks past someone struggling? What kind of vision excludes the simple act of human kindness? As darkness settled over the city, Michael remained on the bench, his usual evening routine forgotten. The city lights reflected off the water, creating patterns that seemed to mock his attempts at organizing life into neat, controllable segments. A nearby seagull watched him with curious eyes, perhaps wondering what kept this suited figure so still in the gathering night. For the first time in years, Michael felt truly lost, not in the physical sense. He knew every street and corner of downtown Seattle, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. The carefully constructed identity he'd built, the goals he'd pursued with such single-minded determination, the success he'd achieved at the cost of everything else. It all seemed to be crumbling under the weight of one simple moment of failed humanity. The following morning dawned with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror Michael's unsettled state of mind. His usual morning routine felt mechanical, disconnected. The precisely timed shower, the carefully selected suit, the artfully styled hair, all seemed like gestures from someone else's life. As he knotted his tie in front of the mirror, his father's words echoed in his thoughts. "It's what you do when you're wearing it that counts." His apartment, a minimalist haven of chrome and leather in a luxury high-rise, suddenly felt sterile and empty. The floor-to-ceiling windows that usually provided his favorite view of the city now seemed to mock him with their transparency, forcing him to look outward when all his thoughts were turned inward. The morning news played quietly on his mounted TV, the financial reports that usually commanded his attention, now fading into background noise. The follow-up meeting with Robert Chen loomed at 9:30. Michael gathered his materials with less than his usual precision, his mind still caught in the undertow of yesterday's events. His briefcase felt heavier than normal, weighted down with more than just documents and his laptop. The drive to work deviated from his usual route. Without consciously deciding to, Michael found himself taking streets that would lead him past yesterday's intersection. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he approached the spot, his eyes scanning the morning crowd. Part of him hoped to see the woman again, though he wasn't sure if he wanted this out of a desire for redemption or punishment. The intersection was busy with its usual morning traffic, but there was no sign of her. Michael found himself studying the faces in the crowd more carefully than he ever had before. A construction worker helping an elderly man navigate around some scaffolding. A barista stepping out of her shop to offer directions to lost tourists. Small acts of kindness that he would have overlooked just days ago now seemed to demand his attention. Parking in his reserved spot at Pacific Northwest Financial, Michael sat in his car for a moment longer than necessary. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. Through the wet windshield, the office tower loomed above him, its upper floors lost in the low clouds. He'd always seen the building as a symbol of achievement, of progress. Now it felt more like a monument to disconnection. The elevator ride to the 40th floor gave him time to compose himself, to try to recapture some of his usual professional demeanor. But his reflection in the polished doors showed a man somehow different from the one who had ridden up yesterday morning. The changes were subtle, a slight loosening of his usual rigid posture, a softening around the eyes. But they were there. Emmy Chen intercepted him as he stepped off the elevator. "Michael, I'm glad I caught you. Dad wanted me to give you these before your meeting." She handed him a folder containing client satisfaction surveys from the past decade. "He thinks they might give you some perspective." Michael thanked her, noting the concern in her expression. Had his distraction yesterday been that obvious? He retreated to his office, spreading the surveys across his desk. Each page told a story of relationships built over years, of trust earned through countless small interactions. Robert Chen's handwritten notes in the margins spoke of birthdays remembered, family milestones celebrated, personal tragedies supported. A knock on his door announced Tom Martinez's arrival. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing a coffee on Michael's desk, just like yesterday, but this time the gesture carried more weight. "Ready for your meeting with Robert?" Michael looked up from the surveys. "I don't know, Tom. Everything feels different today, like I'm seeing things I've been blind to for years." Tom settled into the chair across from him, his expression thoughtful. "You know what makes a good leader, Michael. It's not just about making the right decisions. It's about being able to admit when you've made the wrong ones, about learning and growing from those moments." The words hung in the air between them as Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Robert's assistant. "Mr. Chen is ready for you now." Standing up, Michael gathered the surveys and his notes, but left his presentation materials behind. Somehow, they didn't seem relevant anymore. Walking down the hallway to Robert's corner office, Michael passed the wall of company photographs chronicling Pacific Northwest Financial's history. He'd walked this path hundreds of times, but today he noticed something new. In almost every photo, Robert Chen was pictured not with celebrities or business leaders, but with ordinary clients, employees, community members. Each image captured a moment of genuine connection. Outside Robert's office, Michael paused to straighten his tie, a habitual gesture that now felt like a remnant of a different version of himself. Through the glass walls, he could see Robert. At his desk, his silver hair catching the morning light, the man who had built his legacy not on numbers, but on relationships. on seeing people as people, not obstacles or opportunities. Taking a deep breath, Michael knocked on the door, stepping into a conversation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, leadership, and the true measure of a man's worth. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the windows of the 40th floor, blurring the line between the glass and steel world he'd built for himself and the human world he'd forgotten existed. The evening settled over Seattle. Like a soft blanket, the city lights beginning to twinkle through the persistent drizzle. Michael had left the office earlier than usual, his meeting with Robert Chen having left him with more questions than answers. Rather than heading straight home, he found himself drawn to a small cafe in Pioneer Square, its warm lights and brick facade offering a welcome contrast to the sleek corporate environment he'd left behind. Through the cafe's window, he noticed a familiar figure that made his heart skip a beat. There, sitting at a corner table, was the woman from the wheelchair, the one he'd ignored at the crosswalk. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes. The woman was laughing at something he'd said, her face transformed by joy in a way that made Michael's earlier impression of her seem like a shallow sketch. Michael froze just outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. The couple seemed absorbed in their conversation, sharing what appeared to be a piece of apple pie. From this angle, he could see that the woman's military-style jacket wasn't just a fashion choice. It bore service patches and insignia he didn't recognize. But what caught his eye and made his breath catch was the distinctive medal partially visible on her chest, the Medal of Honor. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just ignored someone struggling with a wheelchair. He'd walked past a decorated war hero, someone who had performed acts of valor so extraordinary that they'd received the nation's highest military decoration. The shame he'd been carrying suddenly doubled in weight, pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Through the window, he watched as the woman, he could now see her name tag reading Captain Emmy Martinez, moved with practiced ease in her wheelchair, her dignity and confidence evident in every gesture. Her companion's attentiveness spoke of a deep respect that went beyond mere courtesy. They were clearly discussing something amusing, their shared laughter creating a bubble of warmth that seemed to extend beyond their table. Michael's phone buzzed. In his pocket, probably another email about tomorrow's meetings, but for the first time in his career, he let it go unanswered. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene before him. The way Captain Martinez's hands moved animatedly as she spoke, the quiet pride in her companion's eyes, the easy comfort they shared. It all spoke of a world of experience and connection he'd been too busy to notice. "Are you going in, or are you just admiring the architecture?" a voice behind him asked, making him jump. He turned to find himself face to face with Tom Martinez, his mentor from the office. Tom's expression changed as he recognized Michael, then shifted again as he glanced through the window. "I see you've noticed my sister," he said quietly. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. "Your sister?" Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the scene inside. "Emmy, retired Army captain, one of the finest helicopter pilots the 160th SAW ever produced." He paused, studying Michael's expression. "But you've met her already, haven't you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he admit to Tom that he'd ignored his sister when she needed help, that he'd been too focused on his presentation to spare a moment for someone who had given so much in service to others? "Yesterday morning," Tom continued, his voice neutral but his eyes keen, "at the intersection of 4th and Pine, Emmy mentioned someone in a suit who almost ran into her wheelchair before hurrying away. I had a feeling it might have been you." Michael felt his carefully constructed professional facade crumbling. "Tom, I didn't know." I was so focused on the presentation, on making partner. I didn't even take the time to really see her. No, Tom agreed. You didn't, but you're seeing her now, aren't you? He gestured toward the window. That Medal of Honor she wears, she earned it pulling 3 fellow pilots out of a burning helicopter under heavy fire in Afghanistan, lost the use of her legs in the process, but saved every one of her crew members. The information hit Michael like waves, each detail making his earlier behavior seem more unconscionable. He watched as Emmy laughed again at something her companion, he said, her face illuminated by more than just the cafe's warm lighting. The man with her is Colonel James Roberts, Tom explained. He was her commanding officer, comes to visit whenever he's in Seattle. They both serve on a Veterans Support Committee now, helping other wounded warriors adjust to civilian life. Michael felt the weight of everything he'd learned pressing down on him. Tom, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. That's just it, Michael, Tom interrupted gently. None of us ever really know someone's story just by looking at them. That's why we have to treat everyone with dignity, with respect. It's not about who they might turn out to be. It's about who we choose to be in each moment. Cafe enveloped them as they entered, carrying the rich aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries. Emmy watched their approach with an expression of mild amusement, her hands folded calmly on the table. Up close, Michael could now see the Medal of Honor clearly. Its light blue ribbon and gold star seemed to capture all the light in the room. Emmy, Colonel Roberts, Tom said. This is Michael Thompson, the colleague I was telling you about. The introduction hung in the air for a moment before Emmy broke into a warm smile. We've almost met before, she said, her voice carrying a hint of gentle humor, though you seemed in quite a hurry at the time. There was no accusation in her tone, but Michael felt the weight of her words nonetheless. Colonel Roberts stood to shake Michael's hand, his grip firm and assessing. Join us, he offered, gesturing to the empty chairs at their table. Michael found himself sitting down, his usual confident demeanor completely abandoned. I owe you an apology, Michael began, his voice rougher than he intended. Yesterday morning, at the intersection, I should have stopped to help. There's no excuse for walking past someone in need. Emmy studied him for a moment, her eyes kind but penetrating. You know what's interesting about moments like that? She said, reaching for her coffee cup. They reveal who we are, but they don't define who we can become. The philosophical tone surprised Michael. He'd expected recrimination, not wisdom. Colonel Roberts nodded in agreement, adding, in combat, we learned quickly that character isn't about never making mistakes. It's about how you respond when you recognize them. Emmy was just telling me about their latest veteran support initiative, Tom said, seamlessly shifting the conversation. They're working on improving accessibility in public spaces. As Emmy described their project, Michael found himself drawn into a world he'd never really considered before. She spoke about the daily challenges faced by disabled veterans, but also about their resilience, their continued desire to serve their communities. Her passion was evident in every word. Her Medal of Honor catching the light occasionally as she gestured. The hardest part isn't the big obstacles, she explained. It's the small ones, the slightly uneven curb cuts, the doors that are just a little too heavy, the people who look through you instead of at you. Her eyes met Michael's on these last words, but there was understanding in them rather than accusation. Colonel Roberts leaned forward, adding, that's why simple acts of assistance matter so much. They're not just about the physical help, they're about acknowledgement, about seeing people as people. The conversation continued, weaving between serious topics and lighter moments. Michael found himself sharing stories about his father, the police officer who had always stopped to help others. Emmy's eyes lit up at this, and she shared her own stories of service, of the brotherhood and sisterhood formed in uniform. As the evening progressed, Michael felt something shifting inside him. The urgency of emails going unanswered, of meetings being scheduled, of deals being made, it all seemed to fade in importance compared to the simple human connection he was experiencing. Here, in this cafe, with these people who had sacrificed so much for others, he was learning more about leadership than any corporate seminar had ever taught him. The Medal of Honor on Emmy's chest became less a symbol of intimidation and more a reminder of the capacity for extraordinary courage in ordinary moments. Every time it caught the light, it seemed to ask him a question about his own choices, his own potential for service. The next morning dawned differently for Michael. As he dressed for work, his movements were more deliberate, more mindful. The previous evening's conversation with Emmy, Colonel Roberts and Tom had left an indelible mark on his perspective. His reflection in the mirror showed a man in transition, still wearing his perfectly tailored suit, but somehow carrying it differently. The morning commute took him past the same intersection where he'd first encountered Emmy. This time, he pulled into a nearby parking spot and spent a few minutes observing. He watched as commuters rushed past each other, most locked in their own private worlds of phones and headphones. But there were moments of connection too. A teenager helping an elderly woman with her shopping bags, a businessman holding the door for a parent with a stroller. Emmy's words from the previous evening echoed in his mind. The small obstacles are the hardest ones. Now that he was really looking, he could see the truth in her statement, the slight lip in the curb cut that had caught her wheelchair, the crossing signal that changed too quickly for someone moving at a slower pace, the crowd that unconsciously created barriers with their hurried indifference. At the office, Michael's morning routine took an unexpected turn. Instead of heading straight to his desk, he found himself in the building's lobby, watching how people navigated the space. He noticed a veteran security guard. Something about the man's bearing reminded him of Colonel Roberts, helping a visitor in a wheelchair through the heavy glass doors. The guard's assistance was offered with a natural dignity that spoke of understanding rather than pity. The guard caught Michael watching and nodded in recognition. "Morning, Mr. Thompson." "Good morning, Jim," Michael replied, realizing with a start that though he'd passed this man hundreds of times, this was the first time he'd really acknowledged him. How long have you been working here?" "Coming up on 15 years, sir. Army before that, 82nd Airborne." The conversation that followed was brief but revealing. Jim shared stories about the people who passed through the lobby each day, their struggles, their kindnesses, their small victories. His perspective on the building's daily life was radically different from the view from the 40th floor. When Michael finally made it to his office, he found an email from Robert Chen waiting for him. The subject line read simply, "A different kind of opportunity." The message inside invited him to join the firm's newly formed Community Impact Committee, focusing on making their services more accessible to underserved populations. As Michael read through the email, he noticed something he'd overlooked yesterday, a small accessibility icon in Robert's email signature, along with a link to the firm's disability advocacy resources. How had he never noticed this before? The answer, he realized, was simple. He'd never been looking. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Emmy asked if you'd be interested in joining us at the VA hospital this weekend. They're doing a mentorship program for newly disabled veterans." The old Michael would have immediately checked his calendar, weighing the professional networking value of such an engagement. The new Michael found himself typing yes before even thinking about his schedule. Some things he was learning were more important than carefully managed time blocks. Opening his laptop, Michael began to work on his regular morning tasks, but his approach felt different. As he reviewed client portfolios, he found himself thinking about the people behind the numbers, their stories, their challenges, their needs. The graphs and charts that had once seemed like the whole picture now felt like mere sketches of much richer narratives. Through his office window, he could see the spot where the Medal of Honor had caught the light on Emmy's chest the previous evening. The memory served as a reminder that courage came in many forms, not just in dramatic moments of battlefield heroism, but in daily choices to see, to help, to connect. The next morning dawned with a clarity that seemed to mirror Michael's shifted perspective. As he dressed for work, his movements were more deliberate, more mindful. The previous evening's conversation with Emmy, Colonel Roberts, and Tom had left an indelible mark on his worldview. His reflection in the mirror showed a man in transition, still wearing his perfectly tailored suit, but somehow carrying it differently, as if the weight of understanding had altered his very posture. The Medal of Honor's image stayed with him, not just as a symbol of Emmy's extraordinary courage, but as a reminder of how easily he had overlooked someone of such significance. He thought about how many other stories, other medals, other acts of valor might be passing by him unnoticed every day on Seattle's busy streets. His morning commute took him deliberately past the same intersection where he'd first encountered Emmy. This time, he pulled into a nearby parking spot and spent several minutes observing the ebb and flow of humanity. He watched as commuters rushed past each other, most locked in their own private worlds of phones and headphones. But there were moments of connection too. A teenager helping an elderly woman with her shopping bags, a businessman holding the door for a parent with a stroller, a barista stepping out to assist a visually impaired customer navigate around some sidewalk construction. Emmy's words from the previous evening echoed in his mind. The small obstacles are the hardest ones. Now that he was really looking, he could see the truth in her statement. The slight lip in the curb cut that had caught her wheelchair, the crossing signal that changed too quickly for someone moving at a slower pace, the crowd that unconsciously created barriers with their hurried indifference. Each small obstacle represented a moment where simple human awareness could make a profound difference. At the office, Michael's morning routine took an unexpected turn. Instead of heading straight to his desk, he found himself lingering in the building's lobby, watching how people navigated the space. He noticed a veteran security guard. Something about the man's bearing reminded him of Colonel Roberts, helping a visitor in a wheelchair through the heavy glass doors. The guard's assistance was offered with a natural dignity that spoke of understanding rather than pity. The guard caught Michael watching and nodded in recognition. "Morning, Mr. Thompson." "Good morning, Jim," Michael replied, realizing with a start that, though he'd passed this man hundreds of times, this was the first time he'd really acknowledged him. "How long have you been working here?" "Coming up on 15 years, sir. Army before that, 82nd Airborne. Jumped into Panama, if you can believe it." Jim's pride in his service was evident, though understated. The conversation that followed was brief but revealing. Jim shared stories about the people who passed through the lobby each day, their struggles, their kindnesses, their small victories. His perspective on the building's daily life was radically different from the view from the 40th floor. He spoke about the early morning cleaning crew, the late-night security team, the maintenance workers who kept the building running, all the invisible heroes whose contributions Michael had never really considered. When Michael finally made it to his office, he found an email from Robert Chen waiting for him. The subject line read simply, "A different kind of opportunity." The message inside invited him to join the firm's newly formed Community Impact Committee, focusing on making their services more accessible to underserved populations, including disabled veterans transitioning to civilian careers in finance. As Michael read through the email, he noticed something he'd overlooked yesterday, a small accessibility icon in Robert's email signature, along with a link to the firm's disability advocacy resources. How had he never noticed this before? The answer, he realized, was simple. He'd never been looking. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Emmy asked if you'd be interested in joining us at the VA hospital this weekend. They're doing a mentorship program for newly disabled veterans. No pressure, but she thought you might bring a valuable perspective on transitioning to civilian corporate life." The old Michael would have immediately checked his calendar, weighing the professional networking value of such an engagement. The new Michael found himself typing yes before even thinking about his schedule. Some things he was learning were more important than carefully managed time blocks. Opening his laptop, Michael began to work on his regular morning tasks, but his approach felt different. As he reviewed client portfolios, he found himself thinking about the people behind the numbers, their stories, their challenges, their needs. The graphs and charts that had once seemed like the whole picture now felt like mere sketches of much richer narratives. Through his office window, he could see the spot where the Medal of Honor had caught the light on Emmy's chest the previous evening. The memory served as a reminder that courage came in many forms, not just in dramatic moments of battlefield heroism, but in daily choices to see, to help, to connect. Emmy's story had affected him more deeply than he'd expected. Her presence in that cafe, laughing and sharing stories despite everything she'd been through, demonstrated a kind of strength that no financial projection could measure. The way she spoke about her experiences, not with bitterness about what she'd lost, but with gratitude for what she could still give, had challenged everything he thought he knew about success and resilience. As the morning progressed, Michael found himself making small but significant changes to his usual routine. When Emmy from accounting struggled with a heavy box of files, he didn't just walk past with a polite nod, he stopped to help. During the morning team meeting, he noticed how one of the junior analysts seemed to be struggling to make his voice heard, and made a point of drawing him into the conversation. Around lunchtime, Tom stopped by his office. "You seem different today," he observed, settling into one of the visitor chairs. "Emmy has that effect on people." Michael nodded, turning away from his computer screen. "I keep thinking about what she said about the small obstacles, about how we don't see them until we choose to look. It's like I've been viewing the world through the wrong lens all this time." "It's not just about the obstacles," Tom replied. "It's about what they represent. Every time Emmy encounters a difficult curb cut or a too heavy door, it's not just a physical challenge. It's a reminder that someone designed that space without considering people like her. But when someone stops to help, it's more than just assistance. It's acknowledgement, recognition, respect." The words hit home. Michael thought about all the times he'd rushed past people struggling with doors, bags, or directions, too focused on his own agenda to spare a moment for others. How many opportunities for connection had he missed? How many chances to make a difference had he ignored? His computer pinged with a calendar reminder for an afternoon client meeting. Usually, this would have sent him into a flurry of preparation, but today, he found himself taking a moment to research the client first. Not just their financial history, but their story. The company, he discovered, had a strong veteran hiring program and had won awards for their workplace accessibility initiatives. This information changed his entire approach to the meeting preparation. Instead of focusing solely on returns and risk assessments, he began thinking about how their investment strategy could support and expand their commitment to inclusive employment. It was a different way of looking at value, one that went beyond mere numbers. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office, Michael found himself drafting an email to Robert Chen, not about the presentation or the promotion or any of the things that had seemed so crucial just days ago. Instead, he wrote about his encounter with Emmy, about what he'd learned about service and leadership from her example, and about his ideas for how Pacific Northwest Financial could better serve the veteran community. The words flowed easily, powered by a conviction he hadn't felt in years. This, he realized, was what true purpose felt like. Not the artificial high of closing a big deal or landing a promotion, but the deep satisfaction of finding a way to make a genuine difference in others' lives. Saturday morning found Michael navigating the antiseptic halls of the VA hospital, following Tom's lead through the maze of corridors. The difference between this building and his sleek office tower couldn't have been more striking. Here, the floors were worn by countless wheelchairs and gurneys, the walls decorated not with abstract art, but with photographs of service members and military unit insignias. The mentorship program was being held in a large recreation room that had been converted for the occasion. As they entered, Michael immediately spotted Emmy, her Medal of Honor catching the morning light as she spoke animatedly with a group of younger veterans. Some were in wheelchairs like her, others stood with prosthetic limbs or leaned on canes, but all listened intently as she shared her story. Colonel Roberts was there too, moving between small groups, his presence bringing a sense of calm authority to the room. He noticed Michael and Tom's arrival, nodding in acknowledgement before returning his attention to a young Marine he was speaking with. "Michael," Emmy called out, waving them over. "I'm glad you could make it." Her smile was warm and genuine, making Michael feel immediately more at ease in this unfamiliar environment. "Let me introduce you to some people who might benefit from your experience in the financial sector." Over the next few hours, Michael found himself engaged in conversations that challenged and inspired him. He met a former Army sergeant who had lost both legs to an IED but was determined to start his own business, a Navy corpsman with a traumatic brain injury who wanted to understand investment strategies for his disability benefits, a young Air Force veteran whose PTSD made traditional office environments challenging but who showed a brilliant mind for market analysis. What struck Michael most was their resilience. Despite their injuries, despite the challenges they faced, each person he spoke with maintained a sense of purpose and determination that humbled him. They didn't want pity or special treatment. They wanted opportunities, understanding, and the chance to continue serving their communities in new ways. During a break, Michael found himself standing with Emmy near the window, watching as Colonel Roberts demonstrated some adaptive techniques to a group of recently injured veterans. "You know," Emmy said, her voice thoughtful, "when I first got this," she touched the Medal of Honor lightly, "I felt almost guilty. There were so many others who did so much more, who gave their lives, but over time I've come to see it as a responsibility rather than an honor. It gives me a platform to help others, to make their journeys a little easier." Michael nodded, thinking about his own platform at Pacific Northwest Financial. "I've been thinking a lot about that, about responsibility, about using what we have to make a difference. I've spent years focused on climbing the corporate ladder, but being here, meeting these veterans, it's making me reconsider what success really means." Emmy smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sometimes the greatest acts of service don't come with medals. They're the small choices we make every day, to see people, to help when we can, to use whatever influence we have to make the world a little better." As the session wound down, Michael found himself exchanging contact information with several veterans who were interested in learning more about careers in finance. He promised to look into internship programs, mentorship opportunities, and ways to make his firm more accessible to disabled veterans. Tom joined them as they were preparing to leave, his expression satisfied. "You know, Michael, when I first suggested you come today, I wasn't sure how you'd take to it, but watching you with these vets, you've got a gift for connecting with people when you let yourself do it." Michael thought about the Michael Thompson of a week ago, the one who had rushed past a struggling veteran without a second thought, too focused on his own ambitions to see the humanity around him. The transformation he'd undergone since then felt both profound and somehow inevitable, as if he'd finally found a path he'd been searching for without knowing it. As they walked out of the hospital into the bright Seattle afternoon, Emmy's Medal of Honor caught the sunlight one more time, sending a flash of gold across the parking lot. But now, instead of seeing it as a symbol of his own shame or failure, Michael saw it as a beacon of possibility, a reminder that every moment offered a choice to serve, to connect, to make a difference in someone's life. The city spread out before them, its streets and buildings holding countless stories of struggle and triumph, of needs unmet and kindnesses yet to be offered. And for the first time in his career, Michael felt truly ready to be the kind of leader who could see those stories, and more importantly, to be part of writing new ones. The following Monday, Michael's office looked different somehow. The same. Furniture occupied the same spaces, the same view stretched out beyond his windows, but his perspective had shifted fundamentally. On his desk, alongside the usual financial reports and market analyses, sat a new folder, proposals for veteran outreach programs he'd spent Sunday drafting. The morning's executive committee meeting carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. As Michael stood at the front of the conference room, he wasn't just presenting another set of financial projections. Instead, he shared his vision for transforming Pacific Northwest Financial's approach to community engagement, particularly focusing on veteran services and accessibility initiatives. "The numbers tell us one story," he began, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "But there's another story we need to consider. Last week, I met some extraordinary individuals at the VA hospital, veterans with incredible skills, determination, and leadership experience who face barriers to entering the financial sector." Robert Chen leaned forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful, as Michael continued, "I'm proposing we establish a comprehensive veterans program, not just hiring initiatives, but mentorship opportunities, adaptive workplace solutions, and partnerships with veteran service organizations. The investment would be minimal compared to the value these individuals could bring to our firm." As he spoke, Michael could see Emmy's Medal of Honor in his mind's eye, its gold star, a reminder of the courage it took to create real change. He shared stories from the VA hospital, the former sergeant with entrepreneurial dreams, the Navy corpsman studying market analysis, the young veterans eager to translate their military experience into civilian success. The board members' reactions varied from curious to concerned. Questions about costs, implementation challenges, and potential risks were raised. But Michael was prepared, not just with numbers and projections, but with something more powerful, genuine conviction. These veterans have already proven their ability to adapt, to overcome challenges, to lead under pressure, he argued. They've demonstrated values that align perfectly with what we claim to stand for: integrity, service, dedication to something larger than themselves. The question isn't whether we can afford to implement these programs, it's whether we can afford not to. Tom Martinez, sitting near the back of the room, nodded almost imperceptibly. His presence reminded Michael of Emmy's words about small obstacles and daily choices. This was his moment to remove some of those obstacles, to make choices that could impact lives beyond his own. After the meeting, Robert Chen asked Michael to stay behind. As the other executives filed out, Robert walked to the window, gazing out at the Seattle skyline. "You know, Michael, when I first reviewed your promotion application, I saw someone with exceptional technical skills but wondered about your understanding of what true leadership means." He turned back to face Michael. "Your presentation last week was technically perfect, but today you showed me something different, something more valuable." Michael thought about how much had changed in just a week. "I've learned that success isn't just about personal achievement," he said. "It's about using our position to create opportunities for others, to make a real difference in people's lives." Robert smiled, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small frame containing a faded photograph of a young soldier. "My father," he explained, "Purple Heart recipient, Vietnam. He never had the opportunities we're talking about creating today, never got to use the leadership skills he developed. In service, that's why your proposal resonates with me." As they discussed the details of implementing the Veterans Program, Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Emmy. "Heard about your presentation from Tom. Would love to help develop the mentorship component. Coffee this week?" Looking at the message, Michael felt a surge of purpose. The promotion he'd been so focused on just a week ago still mattered, but for entirely different reasons now. It wasn't about the corner office or the prestigious title anymore. It was about having the platform to effect real change. Later that afternoon, as Michael walked through the lobby, he stopped to chat with Jim, the security guard. They talked about the proposed Veterans Program, and Jim's eyes lit up with possibility. "You know, sir," he said, "I know quite a few vets who'd jump at chances like this. Sometimes all people need is for someone to open a door." The metaphor wasn't lost on Michael as he watched Jim literally open the door for a woman struggling with a walker. It was these small moments of awareness, of choice, of connection that could transform not just individual lives, but entire institutions. As he stepped out into the Seattle afternoon, Michael realized that his own transformation was far from complete. Each day would bring new opportunities to choose between hurrying past or stopping to help, between focusing solely on profits or considering the human impact of his decisions. The Medal of Honor he'd seen on Emmy's chest had become more than a symbol of her courage. It was a daily reminder of the kind of leader, the kind of person he was choosing to become. 6 months later, the 40th floor of Pacific Northwest. Financial hummed with a different kind of energy. Michael's corner office, earned not just through his financial acumen, but through his transformed approach to leadership, now displayed some unusual items alongside the traditional business. Awards. A framed photograph showed him with a group of veterans at their graduation from the firm's first Veteran Financial Leadership Program. Next to it sat a small model of a military helicopter, a gift from Emmy after he'd helped secure funding for a new adaptive sports program at the VA. The view of Elliott Bay remained spectacular, but Michael no longer saw it as merely a symbol of corporate success. Instead, it reminded him of the broader horizon that had opened up in his life since that fateful morning when he'd chosen to walk past a struggling veteran. The same waters that reflected the morning sun also carried ships bringing soldiers home, some bearing visible wounds, others carrying invisible burdens. Each one represented a story, a potential, a chance to make a difference. Today was particularly special. Pacific Northwest Financial was hosting its first Veteran Employment Summit, bringing together business leaders, veteran service organizations, and veterans themselves to discuss creating more inclusive workplaces. The conference room that had once intimidated Michael with its corporate grandeur now buzzed with a diverse mix of voices, military uniforms mingling with business suits, wheelchairs alongside executive chairs. Emmy sat at the center of it all, her Medal of Honor catching the light as she engaged in animated discussion with CEOs and veteran advocates alike. Her presence had become a regular fixture at the firm, her insights helping shape their veteran initiatives in ways that went far beyond mere corporate social responsibility. She had a way of cutting through bureaucratic obstacles with the same determination she'd once shown in combat. "You know," she said to Michael during a break in the proceedings, "when you first walked past me that morning, I never would have guessed we'd end up here." Her smile held no trace of judgment, only appreciation for how far they'd both come. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best opportunities for growth. Colonel Roberts, who had become a valued advisor to the firm's veteran programs, joined them by the window. 28 veterans hired across 6 departments, he noted, reviewing the program's statistics. But more importantly, a complete shift in how the company thinks about ability, adaptation, and leadership. Michael nodded, thinking about the changes he'd witnessed. The firm had invested in adaptive technology and flexible work arrangements, not just for veterans, but for all employees with disabilities. The mentorship program had evolved into a two-way street, with veterans sharing their leadership experiences while learning about finance. Even the building itself had been modified, with improved accessibility features that Jim, the security guard, had helped design based on his observations of daily challenges. Tom approached their group, accompanied by a young woman in a wheelchair, a recent hire from the Air Force, who was already making waves in risk assessment. "Angela here just caught a market pattern none of us had noticed," he announced proudly. "She says her experience as a tactical analyst gave her a different way of looking at data flows." The conversation that followed exemplified everything Michael had come to value about their new approach. Angela's insights weren't just about numbers. They were informed by her military experience, her adaptation to civilian life, and her unique perspective as someone who navigated the world differently. The firm wasn't just giving opportunities to veterans. It was being transformed by their contributions. As the summit continued, Michael found himself reflecting on his journey. The promotion he'd once pursued so single-mindedly had indeed come through, but it meant something entirely different now. His corner office had become a space for mentoring sessions with veteran employees. His network was being used to create opportunities for others, and his success was measured not just in profits, but in lives impacted. Later that afternoon, Michael led a panel discussion on corporate accountability in veteran hiring. As he looked out at the audience, he saw faces that would have once been invisible to him. The HR manager using sign language to communicate with a deaf veteran. The IT director who had modified workstations for employees with prosthetic limbs. The finance analyst who had served 3 tours before finding his place in the corporate world. "Leadership," Michael began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "isn't about the view from the top. It's about seeing what others might miss, about stopping to help when it would be easier to walk past, about recognizing that true value can't always be measured on a spreadsheet." Emmy, sitting in the front row, touched her Medal of Honor briefly, a gesture Michael had come to recognize as her way of grounding herself in her purpose. The medal no longer filled him with shame, but served as a constant reminder of the extraordinary impact ordinary choices could have. The day concluded with a reception where veterans and executives mingled freely, sharing stories and building connections. Michael watched as Emmy engaged with a young veteran recently injured in service, her presence offering living proof that adaptation didn't mean limitation. Colonel Roberts was deep in conversation with the board chairman about expanding the program to other firms. Tom was introducing Angela to key industry contacts, her wheelchair forgotten as they discussed market strategies. Emmy had become more than just a catalyst for change. She was now a regular consultant for the firm's veteran initiatives. Her Medal of Honor, once a symbol of Michael's shame, had become a beacon of possibility for others. It reminded everyone that courage came in many forms, from battlefield heroism to the daily courage of overcoming obstacles, from the valor of military service to the quiet bravery of starting over in civilian life. After the conference, Michael and Emmy shared coffee in his corner office, now decorated with photographs of successful veteran hires and thank-you letters from families whose lives had been changed by the program. Through the window, they could see the intersection where their story had begun, now featuring improved accessibility features and serving as a model for urban planning. Sometimes I think back to that morning, Emmy mused, her wheelchair positioned near the window. If you had stopped to help me then, we might never have had that moment in the cafe. Sometimes what looks like a failure is just the setup for a bigger success story. Colonel Roberts, who had joined their conversation, nodded in agreement. In the military, we learn that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, but it's how you adapt, how you learn from those moments, that defines your character. The program they'd built together had become a model for other corporations. Michael regularly spoke at business conferences, sharing not just the success metrics, though those were impressive, but the human stories that gave those numbers meaning. Each veteran hired, each accommodation made, each barrier removed, represented a small victory in a larger mission. Tom appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a young veteran who had recently joined their trading desk. "Remember when we used to think success was just about the numbers?" Tom asked with a knowing smile. "Now we know it's about the stories behind them." As the day wound down, Michael found himself back at that same intersection. This time, he stopped deliberately, watching as people moved through the crosswalk. He saw a businessman pause to help an elderly woman with her shopping bags, a student holding the door for someone in a wheelchair, small acts of kindness that might have once gone unnoticed, but now seemed to shine with significance. The Medal of Honor that Emmy wore had taught him more than just the importance of stopping to help. It had shown him that heroism wasn't limited to battlefield courage. It could be found in daily choices to serve others, in decisions to use whatever influence you had to make the world a little more accessible, a little more compassionate, a little more connected. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "Your father would be so proud of who you've become." The tie clip that had once been just a memento now felt like a connection to a legacy of service that he was finally worthy of continuing. Looking up at the Seattle skyline, Michael reflected on how much had changed in a year. The city was the same, but his vision had expanded. Every street corner held potential for connection, every interaction an opportunity to make a difference. The success he'd once chased now seemed hollow compared to the fulfillment of helping others succeed. Emmy's Medal of Honor had become more than just a symbol of her battlefield courage. It was a daily reminder that true leadership meant seeing people, stopping to help, and using whatever platform you had to create positive change. The woman he'd once hurried past had become one of his greatest teachers, showing him that sometimes the most valuable medals were earned not in moments of dramatic heroism, but in daily choices to serve others. If this story touched your heart and made you think differently about the choices we make each day, please consider becoming part of our community by subscribing to our channel. Every week, we bring you powerful stories of transformation, courage, and the extraordinary impact that ordinary choices can have on people's lives. By hitting that subscribe button, you'll join a growing family of viewers who believe in the power of storytelling to change perspectives and inspire action. We share stories that remind us that heroes walk among us every day, some wearing medals, others simply waiting for someone to stop and help. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Each one is carefully crafted to help us all see the world a little differently, to recognize the medals of honor that exist in everyday acts of kindness, and to remember that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest choices. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can create a world where no one walks past someone in need, where every story of service is honored, and where leadership is measured not by personal success, but by how many others we help succeed along the way.